They say rock bottom is a solid foundation to build on, but standing in the freezing rain staring at the charred skeleton of a house I didn't know existed, it felt a lot more like a grave. I had exactly $4.12 to my name, a father who looked at me with nothing but disappointment, and a family secret buried under tons of wet ash. I was supposed to be dead to this place, and this place was supposed to be dead to me. But the key in my pocket didn't just unlock a property. It was about to unlock a lie that had shaped my entire existence. I was about to find out that everything I knew about my life was wrong. And it all started with a crowbar and a desperate choice. But before we dig into the story together, if you love tales about uncovering the truth and finding hope in the darkest places, please hit that like button and subscribe to The Farmer's Promise. It costs you nothing, but it helps this channel immensely and tells YouTube to share this story with others who need to hear it. Now, let Ethan tell you about the day his life ended, and the day it truly began. The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days when I finally killed the engine of my rusted sedan. It was a relentless, gray drizzle that seemed to seep right through the pitted metal roof of the car and settle deep into my marrow. The silence that followed the engine cutting out felt heavy, a physical weight pressing against my eardrums, heavier than the debt collector's voicemails I deleted that morning. Heavier even than the crushing disappointment in my father's voice the last time we spoke. I sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white, staring through the water-streaked windshield at an inheritance that looked more like a crime scene than a salvation. My name is Ethan Potts, and at 21 years old, I was officially a statistic. I was a college dropout, a former architecture student who had cracked under the pressure of his father's legacy before his junior year even began. I had a bank account hovering in the single digits, $4.12 to be exact, and a pristine eviction notice from my apartment complex in Columbus lying on the passenger seat. I could still smell the sterile lemon cleaner of the dean's office where I had signed the withdrawal papers, a scent that now made me nauseous. When the lawyer Arthur Henderson had called me 3 days ago, I thought it was a prank. I had been told my grandmother, Mary Potts, died when I was an infant. My parents had been very clear about that. She was gone, the farm was gone, that part of our history was buried deep beneath my father's carefully constructed suburban life. But Arthur Henderson didn't deal in pranks. He dealt in deeds and trusts. He told me Mary had passed away only 2 months ago, and that for reasons known only to her, she had left me everything. I stepped out of the car, my canvas sneakers instantly sinking into the mud. The cold wetness soaked my socks immediately, sending a shiver up my spine. The air here was different than the city. It was raw and aggressive. It smelled of wet ash, ozone, and rotting leaves. The property was 40 acres of overgrown briar and neglected pasture, but the centerpiece, the thing that was supposed to be my new home, was a blackened skeleton. The farmhouse had burned down 3 weeks after Mary died. Faulty wiring in the old walls, the fire marshal had said. Mr. Henderson was waiting for me by the stone gateposts, holding a large black umbrella that seemed immune to the wind. He looked entirely out of place, a figure cut from a magazine and pasted onto a disaster. His Italian leather shoes were coated in a layer of brown muck, and he grimaced slightly as he shifted his weight, trying to keep his balance on the slick grass. "Mr. Potts," he said, his voice dry and professional, cutting through the sound of the rain. "I'm sorry the circumstances aren't more welcoming." "It's fine," I lied. My voice sounded thin in the open air, swallowed by the vastness of the gray sky. "It's land. Land is something." He nodded, reaching into his briefcase. He pulled out a heavy brass key and a thick manila envelope. "The taxes are paid for the next 2 years. The insurance? Well, there was no policy on the structure itself. It was an oversight your grandmother never rectified. She didn't trust insurance companies much. But the land is free and clear." I took the key. It was cold and heavy, a relic from a different time, the metal worn smooth by fingers that weren't mine. I turned it over in my hand, wondering if Mary had held it the same way. "There is one more thing," Henderson said, pointing a gloved finger toward the ruins. "The fire crews mentioned they saw a floor safe in what used to be the study. It's fireproof. We haven't attempted to open it. She left instructions in her will, Very specific instructions. That only you were to touch it. I looked at the charred remains of the house. Blackened beams jutted up like broken ribs against the gray sky. A chimney stood solitary and defiant in the center, the only thing that had refused to fall. It felt fitting. I was a ruin, inheriting a ruin. Thank you, Mr. Henderson. He hesitated, looking at me with a flicker of pity that made my stomach turn. He saw the frayed cuffs of my jacket, the dark circles under my eyes that no amount of sleep could fix. He knew I had nowhere else to go. He knew I was just a kid who had lost his way. There's a motel in town, Ethan. The Starlight. It's not much, but it's warm. If you need, I'll be fine. I cut him off, perhaps too sharply. I couldn't tell him that my net worth wouldn't cover a night at a motel, let alone a warm meal. I'm going to camp out, get a feel for the place. I have gear in the car. He nodded once, adjusted his umbrella, and walked to his Lincoln. I watched him drive away, the taillights disappearing into the mist, fading like red eyes blinking shut, leaving me alone with the ghosts and the rain. The first order of business was survival. I walked toward the only structure that still had a roof, a tractor shed about 50 yards from the house. It was leaning precariously to the left, the wood silvered by decades of weather and covered in emerald moss, but inside it was dry. It smelled of old diesel, dry hay, and mice. I dragged a blue tarp from my trunk and cleared a space in the corner, setting up a pathetic little camp. A sleeping bag that had seen better days, a flashlight with fading batteries, a jug of water, and a box of granola bars. That was my entire life. Night fell quickly, bringing a cold that seeped through the cracks in the shed walls. I couldn't sleep. The silence of the country wasn't quiet. It was loud with the wind in the trees and the settling of the earth. Every snap of a twig sounded like an intruder. Hunger gnawed at my ribs, a dull ache that I was becoming too familiar with. I needed money. If there was anything in that safe, gold, cash, bonds, I could sell it. I could get a bus ticket somewhere warm. I could restart. I could disappear before my failure became permanent. Driven by a mix of greed and desperation, I grabbed the tire iron from my car and clicked on my flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the rain that was now falling sideways. I picked my way through the rubble of the farmhouse. The smell of wet char was overpowering, lodging in the back of my throat like a physical weight. I found the safe in the center of the wreckage, half buried under a fallen support beam. It took me an hour of grunting and straining, slipping in the ash, to leverage the beam off. My hands were raw and bleeding by the time I cleared the dial. I didn't have the combination, but the heat of the fire had warped the locking mechanism. The heavy iron door was slightly ajar. I pried it open with the tire iron, the metal screeching in protest, my heart hammering against my ribs. I shone the light inside, praying for a stack of bills. I needed green. I needed a lifeline. It was empty of money. No jewelry, no silver, no bonds. Instead, stacked neatly, preserved against the inferno that had taken everything else, were journals. Leather-bound, worn at the edges, smelling of old paper and lavender. I counted them. 21. One for every year I had been alive. I sat back on my heels in the ash, disappointment crashing over me like a wave. Books. She had left me books. I grabbed the top one, ready to toss it into the mud in a fit of childish rage, but the date on the spine caught my eye. 2012. I was 12 in 2012. I opened it. The pages were cream-colored, the handwriting cramped but elegant, blue ink flowing across the page. I flipped to a random date, October 14th. The breath hitched in my throat. I saw my boy win the spelling bee today. The word was chrysanthemum. He looked so small on that big stage, wearing that blue tie James always makes him wear. I could see him tugging at the collar. He hates that tie. When he won, he looked right past me in the crowd. I wanted to run to him, to grab him and tell him how smart he is, but I'd promised James Potts I'd stay away if he'd just let me see him sometimes. Watching him grow from a distance is both my greatest joy and deepest sorrow. I hope he knows somehow that I was there. I'm always there. I dropped the book. It landed in the ash with a soft thud. The memory of that day washed over me. I remember the blinding stage lights, the pressure in my chest, the way my father had nodded curtly when I won, already checking his watch for his next meeting. I remembered looking into the dark auditorium, searching for something. A warmth I couldn't name. I had felt eyes on me, loving eyes, but I had assumed it was my imagination. My parents had told me she was crazy. They said she was a danger, a recluse who hated us. "She's dead to us," my father would say, his voice tight with a specific kind of anger I never understood. "And it's better if you think she's dead too." But she had been there. I picked up another journal, then another. High school graduation. My soccer games. The play I did in 10th grade where I only had 3 lines. Ticket stubs were taped to the pages, wrinkled and faded. There was a parking receipt from the day I moved into my college dorm just 3 years ago. I opened the journal marked with the year of my 18th birthday. "He looks so handsome moving into the dorms," she wrote. "He looks like he carries the weight of the world, though." I saw him arguing with James by the car. James was pointing at the architecture building, and Ethan was looking at the ground. I wish I could tell him that he doesn't have to build skyscrapers to be tall. He just has to be himself. I packed a jar of apple butter and left it at the front desk for him, anonymous. I hope he likes it. I remembered that jar. I had eaten it with a spoon in my dorm room, wondering who had sent it. It had tasted like cinnamon and home, a home I didn't know I had. I sat in the ruins of her house, surrounded by the black scars of the fire, and for the first time in years, I wept. I didn't just cry. I unraveled. I cried for the grandmother I never knew. I cried for the lies I had been told. And I cried for the loneliness that radiated off every page. A woman who had loved me so fiercely from the shadows that she had documented every moment of my life while eating dinner alone in this farmhouse. The wind howled through the skeletal beams, chilling the sweat on my neck, but I didn't feel the cold anymore. I felt a strange, terrifying tether snapping into place. I couldn't sell this land. I couldn't take the money and run. She had watched me for 21 years. The least I could do, the absolute least, was stay long enough to clean up the mess. I slept in the shed that night, clutching the 2012 journal to my chest, the smell of diesel mixing with the faint, phantom scent of lavender rising from the pages. The next weeks were a blur of physical agony. I had expected the emotional weight of the inheritance to be the hardest part, but I hadn't anticipated the sheer brutality of the labor. The farm didn't care about my feelings, it only cared about my muscles. I had no money for heavy machinery, so I cleared the debris by hand. I woke up every morning with my hands curled into claws, my back screaming in protest. My architecture degree had taught me about load-bearing walls and tensile strength, but it hadn't taught me how to leverage a charred oak beam out of a basement, or how to rip invasive briars out of the earth without shredding my skin. I created a routine to keep the madness at bay. Wake up with the sun, eat a granola bar, drag charred timber to a burn pile, hack at the multiflora rose bushes that had swallowed the yard, drink water from the rusty tap on the side of the shed, repeat until the sun went down. It was a penance. I was stripping away the layers of neglect, both on the land and inside myself. As I worked, I thought about my father, James Potts. He was a man of steel and glass, an architect who designed cold, imposing corporate headquarters. He hated dirt. He hated disorder. He had raised me to be a replica of himself, and when I had cracked under the pressure, dropping out of the program he'd pulled strings to get me into, he looked at me as if I were a structural failure, a collapsed wall. Here, covered in soot and sweat, picking splinters out of my palms by the light of a lantern, I felt more real than I ever had in a drafting studio. One afternoon, late in October, I was fighting with a massive oak stump near the driveway. It was rot-blackened and stubborn, its roots gripping the earth like iron fingers. I was hacking at it with a dull axe, frustration boiling over into a shout, when I heard the rumble of an engine. I spun around, chest heaving. An ancient red pickup truck was idling at the gate. The driver's door creaked open, and a woman stepped out. She looked to be in her 70s, wearing denim overalls and a flannel shirt that had seen better decades. Her hair was white steel, pulled back in a severe bun, and her face was a map of deep lines etched by sun and wind. She watched me struggle for a long moment, her eyes narrowing. I wiped the sweat from my forehead, feeling self-conscious. I must have looked like a wild animal, dirty, unshaven, desperate. "You're holding the axe wrong," she said. Her voice was like gravel in a mixer, rough but steady. "Your grip is too high. You're gonna slip and take your shin off, and I'm too old to drag you to the hospital." "I'm fine," I said, defensive, tightening my grip on the handle. She ignored me. She walked to the back of her truck, grabbed a heavy chain, and marched over to the stump. She moved with a surprising economy of motion, no wasted energy. She wrapped the chain around the root ball with practiced ease, hooked the other end to her trailer hitch, and got back in the driver's seat. "Stand back, city boy," she yelled out the window. She gunned the engine. The truck roared, tires spinning for a second before gripping the gravel. With a groan of tearing earth that sounded like a scream, the stump ripped free, dragging a cloud of soil with it. She hopped out, unhooked the chain, and tossed it back in the bed. Then she walked up to me and extended a calloused hand. "Ruth Miller. I live next door. Mary was my best friend." I took her hand. Her skin was rough like sandpaper, her grip stronger than mine. "Ethan Potts." Ruth looked me up and down, her expression softening just a fraction. "I know who you are. Mary talked about you so much. I feel like I raised you myself, though I expected you to be sturdier." "I'm working on it," I mumbled, looking at my boots. "You got her eyes," Ruth said, the gruffness vanishing for a second. "And her stubbornness, apparently. Sleeping in a shed in October? You're lucky you haven't frozen to death." "I'm managing." "You're starving," she corrected. She reached into the cab of her truck and pulled out a Tupperware container. "Meatloaf. It's cold, but it'll keep you alive. Don't think this means I'm gonna baby you. Mary would haunt me if I let her grandson wither away, but you pull your own weight out here." I opened the container. The smell of savory meat, onions, and ketchup hit me, and my stomach let out a treacherous growl. I ate it right there, standing in the driveway using my fingers. It was the best thing I had ever tasted. Ruth became my lifeline. She didn't offer charity, she offered education. She taught me how to sharpen the axe so it sang through the wood instead of chewing it. She taught me how to identify the difference between poison ivy and Virginia creeper. She showed me how to prime the old well pump so the water didn't taste like rust. More importantly, she gave me the history my parents had erased. We were taking a break one afternoon, sitting on the tailgate of her truck. I had been clearing the foundation of the house, and I had found a heavy wooden door set into the ground, untouched by the fire. A storm cellar. "She kept everything down there," Ruth said, nodding at the cellar doors. "Said the house was for living, but the cellar was for remembering." I spent the next day prying the doors open. The hinges were rusted shut, requiring a liberal application of oil and brute force. When they finally gave way, the air that rushed out was cool and smelled of damp earth, vinegar, and thyme. I descended the concrete steps with my flashlight, the beam cutting through dancing dust motes. It was a cathedral of preservation. Shelves lined every wall, floor to ceiling, filled with mason jars. Hundreds of them. Peaches floating in golden syrup, green beans packed in tight rows, tomatoes red as blood, and jar after jar of a dark, rich substance I couldn't identify. They were labeled in Mary's handwriting. Peaches 1998, beans 2005, apples 2015. On a workbench in the center sat a heavy iron canning pot, a box of paraffin wax, and a tin box. I opened the tin box. It was filled with black and white photographs. I flipped through them, expecting to see strangers. Instead, I saw a boy. A young boy with a gap-toothed smile, covered in mud, holding a prize-winning pumpkin almost as big as he was. He was laughing, his head thrown back in pure, unadulterated joy. It was my father. I stared at the image, trying to reconcile this dirty, happy child with the man who wore three-piece suits on Saturdays and panicked if a drop of wine touched the tablecloth. There were other photos. Him driving a tractor, him feeding chickens, him hugging Mary, my grandmother, with a fierce, clingy love. I took the photo to Ruth that evening. She looked at it and sighed, a sound that carried a lifetime of complications. "He was happy here, you know," she said quietly, "before he got it in his head that he needed to be someone else." "He told me he hated it," I said, tracing the edge of the photo. "He told me he grew up miserable. He told me he escaped." "He grew up poor, Ethan. There's a difference," Ruth said sharply. "James was a proud boy. The kids at school, they can be cruel. They made fun of his patched clothes, They made fun of Mary's accent. Somewhere along the line, he decided that home was something to be ashamed of. She handed the photo back to me. When he met your mother, well, she came from money. Real money. James reinvented himself to fit into her world. He cut off the parts of himself that didn't fit in a country club. And that included this farm. And his mother. I went back to the journals that night. I found the entry from 1995. James brought his fiancée to meet me today. Mary had written. She is beautiful, and she looks at him like he is the sun. But I saw the shame in James's eyes when she looked at my worn hands and my simple kitchen. He flinched when I offered her tea in a chipped mug. He kept checking the time. He never came back after that day. But I understand. Sometimes people have to leave home to find themselves, even if they lose themselves in the leaving. I will wait. A mother always waits. The words burned into me. My father's pressure, his obsession with success, his terror of my failure. It wasn't about me. It was about him. He was terrified of slipping back, of becoming that boy in the patched clothes again. He had built a fortress of wealth to keep the poverty out, and I had been a brick in that wall. When I crumbled, his fortress was threatened. I wasn't angry anymore. I was just sad. Then the winter came, and it came with a vengeance that made my internal revelation seem trivial. In early December, a blizzard buried the county. The temperature dropped to 5 below zero. My shed, insulated only by hay bales and tarps, was no match for the wind. The cold was a physical antagonist, seeking out every gap in my clothing. I woke up one morning with a throat like broken glass and a chest that felt like it was filled with concrete. I tried to get up to boil water, but the world spun violently. I collapsed back onto my cot. The cold was a physical weight, pressing me down. I shivered so hard my teeth rattled, creating a rhythmic clicking sound in the silent shed. Time lost its meaning. The light in the shed faded to gray, then black, then gray again. I was vaguely aware of the wind howling outside, sounding like a screaming woman. In my delirium, the shed dissolved. I wasn't in the cold anymore. I was back in the architecture studio, trying to build a model that kept collapsing. My father was there, yelling, but his voice was Mary's voice. Then the scene shifted. I was in a warm kitchen. There was a smell of apples and cinnamon. A woman was standing over me. She had gray hair loose around her shoulders and kind, crinkling eyes. She placed a cool hand on my forehead. "Hold on, Ethan," she whispered. Her voice was the sound of pages turning. "You're building something. Don't let go now. The foundation is strong." "Grandma?" I croaked, my voice a ruin. "I'm here, baby. I'm always here." The darkness took me then. I woke up to the smell of chicken broth and Vicks Vapo Rub. I was in a bed. A real bed with flannel sheets. The room was warm, lit by a soft lamp. There was a quilt over me, heavy and comforting, stitched with patterns of stars. Ruth was sitting in a rocking chair in the corner, knitting. She looked up when I stirred. "About time," she said, though her voice lacked its usual bite. "I found you 3 days ago. You didn't show up for coffee. Found you half frozen in that damn shed, talking to people who weren't there." I tried to sit up, but my body felt heavy, drained. "How?" "Pneumonia," she said, putting down her needles. "Doctor said if I'd been an hour later, we'd be having a very different conversation, or a funeral." She walked over and placed a hand on my forehead, just like in the dream. Her hand was rough, but her touch was gentle. "You were talking in your sleep," she said softly. "You kept calling me Grandma." I looked away, embarrassed, feeling the heat rise in my cheeks. "I'm sorry. I was confused." "Don't be sorry," Ruth said. Her eyes were wet. "Mary would have given anything to hear you say that. The whole town has been watching you, Ethan. We were waiting to see if you were going to run like James did. But you stayed. You nearly died staying. She smoothed the blanket over me. "You aren't a guest anymore, Ethan. You're family. Now drink this soup before I force-feed you." Spring arrived not as a gentle awakening, but as an explosion of life. The snow melted, revealing the mud I had wrestled with, but now green shoots were pushing through the black ash. The air lost its bite and smelled of wet earth and promise. I didn't return to the shed. The community, people I had never met, people who remembered Mary's kindness, descended on the farm. It started with Ruth, but then came the Millers, the Davises, the Schmidts. They brought lumber, tools, and casseroles. They didn't ask for money. They just showed up. Mary delivered my first baby during a blizzard, one man told me as he hammered a frame. Mary gave us food when the mill shut down, a woman said as she painted siding. She saved my dog, another said. We built a cabin. It wasn't grand. It sat on the original stone foundation of the farmhouse, a modest one-bedroom structure with a wide porch and a wood stove. It was built with mismatched lumber and donated windows, but to me it was the most beautiful building on earth. It wasn't built on debt or ego. It was built on goodwill. As the house neared completion, I decided to bring life back to the land. I told Ruth I wanted to order 50 chicks. Since I was still dead broke, she fronted me the cash for the birds and the feed, telling me I could pay her back in eggs and manure for her garden. I spent my evenings reading Mary's journals, not for emotional closure, but for instruction. She had detailed guides on animal husbandry, crop rotation, and soil pH. One afternoon, one of the hens grew lethargic, her breathing raspy. Panic set in. I couldn't lose a single life. I felt responsible for every heartbeat on this land. I called the local vet clinic, my voice shaking. An hour later, a dusty Jeep pulled up. Sarah Jenkins hopped out. She looked young to be running her own mobile clinic, perhaps 27. With wild curly hair pulled back in a messy ponytail and eyes that were sharp and intelligent behind wire-rimmed glasses. She wore muck boots that looked like they had seen plenty of use. "You the guy trying to resurrect Mary's place?" she asked, grabbing her bag. "That's me, Ethan. I'm Sarah. Let's see the patient." She was efficient and gentle. She held the hen with a tenderness that surprised me, listening to its chest with a stethoscope. She diagnosed a respiratory infection, administered an antibiotic, and showed me how to mix electrolytes into the water. "You've got a good setup here," she said, looking around the coop I built. "Most city folks come out here and try to raise chickens in a cardboard box. You did your homework." "I had a good teacher," I said, tapping the journal in the back pocket of my jeans. Sarah smiled, and it felt like the sun coming out from behind a cloud. "Mary's journals? Ruth told me about those. That's intense." "It's everything," I said. Sarah didn't leave immediately. She stayed to help me fix a gap in the chicken wire where a fox had been probing. We talked, really talked. I told her about the architecture degree I hated, the pressure, the failure. She told me about leaving a high-paying clinic in Chicago because she was tired of treating designer poodles and wanted to treat cows and goats. "I felt like I was suffocating," she admitted, leaning against the fence. "Everyone thought I was crazy to leave, but I couldn't breathe there. Here, the air is real." "I know the feeling," I said. She came back the next week to check on the hen. Then she came back just to see me. We planted the garden together, her hands dirty alongside mine. We painted the porch. We fell into a rhythm that felt as natural as the seasons. One evening we were exploring Ruth's barn, looking for old fence posts, when we found them. Hidden in the back corner, wrapped in wet burlap to keep the roots viable, were saplings. "Apple trees," Sarah whispered, examining the tags. "Heirloom varieties. Arkansas black. Grimes golden. These are rare, Ethan." I looked at the tag. In Mary's handwriting, it read, "For the future." She grafted these. I realized. She was saving them. She knew she wouldn't see them bear fruit. We planted the orchard the next day. It was back-breaking work. Digging holes in the rocky soil, mixing in compost, and staking the fragile trunks. But as we tamped the earth down around the last tree, I felt a sense of permanence settle into my bones. These trees wouldn't bear fruit for years. Planting them was an act of faith. It was a promise to stay. I started using Mary's canning equipment. I followed her recipes from the journals: apple butter, spicy pickles, peach preserves. The first time I made the apple butter, the smell filled the cabin. Cinnamon, cloves, and cooked apples. It was the smell of the dream I had when I was sick. I made a video about the process, mostly to show my friends back home that I hadn't died, and uploaded it to YouTube with the title, Mary's Legacy Farm. I woke up the next morning to 10,000 views, then 100,000. People were hungry for what I had found: connection, history, redemption. 3 years passed. The saplings grew from fragile sticks into sturdy young trees. The cabin weathered into a soft gray that blended with the woods. I wasn't rich, but I had enough. I sold my preserves at the farmer's market, and the YouTube revenue covered the bills. I had scars on my hands and dirt permanently etched into my fingerprints. And I had never been happier. I was 24 now, and for the first time in my life I felt like an adult. On the 3rd anniversary of my arrival, Arthur Henderson's car rolled up the driveway. I wasn't afraid of him anymore. I walked out to meet him, Sarah by my side, her hand in mine. "You're still here," Henderson said, stepping out of the car. He looked around at the thriving garden, the painted cabin, and the blooming orchard. He actually smiled. "I must admit, Mr. Potts, I lost a bet with myself. I'm still here," I said. He handed me a letter. She left this in trust. Instructions were to deliver it only if you were still living on the land after 3 years. If you had sold it, I was to burn it. My hands trembled as I took the envelope. I walked to the orchard, sitting on a wooden bench beneath the trees Mary had grafted. Sarah sat beside me, silent and supportive, her shoulder pressing against mine. I opened the letter. The paper was crisp. "My dearest Ethan, if you are reading this, you've stayed. You've built something. I knew you would, because you have my hands and my heart even if we never got to know each other properly. I'm sorry I couldn't fight harder to be in your life, but your parents thought they were protecting you from poverty and struggle. They were wrong, but they meant well. Fear makes people do terrible things, my love. Forgive them. Here is what I need you to know. You were never unwanted. Every seed I saved, every jar I preserved, every fence post I mended. I did it thinking, maybe one day my grandson will need this. This farm was always meant for you, not because you are my blood, but because I hoped you would be the kind of person who understands that home isn't where you come from. It's what you build with your own hands and fill with love. You have given me the greatest gift, even after I am gone. You have made my life's work matter. You have turned my loneliness into legacy. Welcome home, my beautiful boy. You are always home. Love, Grandma Mary." I let the tears fall, hot and cleansing. I didn't wipe them away. Sarah squeezed my hand, resting her head on my shoulder. "She knew," I whispered. "She always knew." We held the first harvest festival that October. It was supposed to be a small gathering for the neighbors, but half the county showed up. Tables were set up under the apple trees, groaning under the weight of potluck dishes, fried chicken, potato salad, pies of every description. The air smelled of wood smoke, cider, and fallen leaves. I stood on the porch, watching the scene. Ruth was holding court near the punch bowl, looking proud and fierce in a new floral dress. Sarah was laughing with a group of children near the chicken coop, showing them how to hold the hens. The YouTube subscribers had sent gifts, seeds from all over the world, handmade quilts, letters of encouragement. Then I saw a car pull up at the end of the long driveway. It wasn't a pickup truck. It was a silver Mercedes, gleaming and out of place against the gravel. The chatter died down as a man stepped out. He looked older, grayer than I remembered. He wore a suit, but he had taken off the tie, the top button of his shirt undone. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot, his eyes scanning the property with a mixture of recognition and fear. It was my father. I froze. The old instinct, to shrink, to apologize, to explain myself, flared up in my gut. I felt 12 years old again, standing on a spelling bee stage. But then I looked at my hands. They were calloused, stained with walnut holes and soil. They were strong hands, my grandmother's hands. I walked down the steps and across the grass. The crowd parted for me, sensing the weight of the moment. My father looked at me. He looked at the cabin I had built. He looked at the orchard. He looked at the people who had become my family. "Ethan," he said. His voice was rough, uncertain. "I saw the video. The one about the apple butter." "Hello, Dad. It looks different," he said, gesturing vaguely at the farm. "But the same. The foundation. You kept the foundation. It's home." I said simply. He looked down at his polished shoes, which were already gathering dust. "I didn't think you could do it. I thought you'd freeze or starve. I thought—" He trailed off, his composure cracking like a facade with a stress fracture. "I thought you were like me, too weak to stay." "I'm not like you," I said gently. "And that's okay." I reached into the pocket of my apron and pulled out a small jar of apple butter. It was dark, rich, and spiced with cinnamon, Mary's exact recipe. "Taste it," I said, holding it out. He hesitated, looking at the jar like it was a grenade. Then, slowly, he took it. He dipped a finger in, unconcerned with the dirt on his hands or the eyes of the crowd. He tasted it. I watched his face crumble. The corporate architect dissolved. The walls he had built around himself for 50 years collapsing in an instant. For a moment, I didn't see the man who had disowned his mother. I saw the boy with the pumpkin. I saw the child who had been happy here before the world told him he shouldn't be. "It tastes just like hers," he whispered, tears spilling over and tracking down his cheeks. "Exactly like hers." "Welcome home, Dad," I said. He stepped forward and hugged me. It was awkward and stiff at first, but then he held on tight, shaking with silent sobs. I hugged him back, forgiving him not because he asked for it, but because I understood him. He had run from his ghost. I had embraced mine. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in bruised purples and golds, the party wound down. Ruth walked up to me, holding something heavy in her arms. It was Mary's old iron canning pot, the blackened cast iron that had cooked 1,000 jars of preserves. "She'd be so proud, Ethan," Ruth said, her voice thick with emotion. "You did it. You saved us all, I think." I took the pot. It was heavy, grounding. "Thank you, Ruth, for everything." I left the cleanup to the others for a moment and walked up the hill to the small family cemetery plot. It was cleaned up now, the weeds gone, the iron fence painted black. I stood before Mary's headstone. Mary Potts, beloved mother, keeper of the land. The wind rustled the leaves of the apple trees, a sound like a whispered conversation. I placed a jar of my first successful batch of apple butter on the stone base. Next to it, I placed the weathered journal from 2012, the year of the spelling bee. The year she watched me and I didn't see her. "I see you now," I whispered to the wind. "I see you." I turned around and looked down at the farm. The lights of the cabin were warm and inviting against the gathering dusk. Sarah was waving at me from the porch. My father was sitting with Ruth, listening to a story, a mug of cider in his hand. I wasn't the abandoned college dropout anymore. I wasn't the failure. I wasn't the boy who looked past his grandmother. I was Ethan Potts. I was Mary's grandson. I was a farmer. I was home. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to The Farmer's Promise and turn on notifications so you never miss another tale of resilience, hidden truths, and the families we build when life gives us a second chance. Share this with someone who needs to hear it.